Study Session 6. The 1960 Independence Constitution and the First Republic in Nigeria. Introduction. Our last two study sessions were largely devoted to a discussion of pre-independence constitutions in Nigeria, with emphasis on their distinctive features, strengths, and weaknesses. In this study session, however, we will focus on constitutional developments in the post-independence era in Nigeria. Our discussion will start with highlighting of major political and historical developments that led to the adoption of the 1960 Independence Constitution. Also, the major features, merits, and shortcomings of the Independence Constitution will be identified and discussed with reference to the First Republic, which was between 1960 and 1966. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to identify and explain major political and historical developments that preceded the adoption of the 1960 Independence Constitution, and discuss the major features, merits or strengths, and the merits or shortcomings of the 1960 Independence Constitution. Political and historical background to the 1960 Independence Constitution. The Littleton Constitution, which was supposed to be reviewed in 1956 due to its deficiencies, was challenged by nationalists. The review was put on hold due to the setting up of the Foster-Sutton Commission of Inquiry into Bribery and Corruption in the Eastern Region. From the 23rd of May to the 26th of June 1957, there was a constitutional conference in Lancaster House in London, where the following decisions were made. The Western and Eastern regions were granted self-government in 1957, while the North agreed to have her own in 1959. As a result, reserved powers of the governors were removed. The Premier of a region became the chairman of the Executive Council. To this end, the regions must ensure the independence of the judiciary and public services. Provision was made for the post of Premier. An upper house in the federal legislature, known as the Senate, was created. This Senate was to be composed of 12 members from each of the 3 regions and the Southern Cameroon, 4 members from the Federal Territory of Lagos, and 4 special members to be appointed by the Governor General at his own discretion. Membership of the House of Representatives was increased to 312, distributed according to the population, that is, a member for a population of 100,000 of each area in the country. The Eastern region was to have a House of Chiefs in addition to the existing House of Assembly. A Prime Minister was to head the federal government. The Southern Cameroon was to be raised to the status of a region. It was agreed to at the conference that there should be a fair payment and just compensation for property acquired for public purposes. Nigeria was to become an independent nation on the 1st of October 1960. The fundamental human rights, which would guarantee the liberties of every individual, were to be inserted in the Independence Constitution. The problem of minorities. The conference finally agreed to the appointment of a commission of inquiry and to recommend the creation of one or more states. Sir Henry Willink was appointed to look into the affairs of the minority groups in the country. Police to continue to be under federal control. the Nigerianization policy was to be pursued. Key posts in the public service were to be occupied by Nigerians. That while adult male suffrage would be used in the north, universal adult suffrage should be used in the east, west, Lagos and the southern Cameroon to elect members of the federal and regional legislatures. Tip: the implementation of the decisions of the Constitutional Conference of 1957 led to the adoption of Southern Cameroon as a separate region with its own premier. The stoppage of all the ex-officio British officials, except the Governor-General, from being members of the Executive Council, and the beginning of self-government on the 8th of August 1957 in eastern and western regions. Also, on the 2nd of September 1957, Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was appointed Nigeria's first Prime Minister by the Governor-General. Another constitutional conference held in Lagos from the 29th of September to the 27th of October 1958 agreed on the following. 1. It agreed that October 1st, 1960 be Independence Day for Nigeria. And 2. The conference accepted the inclusion of a list of fundamental human rights in the Constitution to protect the citizens against arbitrary use of power by the government. The conference had 114 delegates, and advisors from various political parties were also in attendance. The conference discussed the report of 2 special commissions set up in 1957, that is, the Fiscal Allocation Committee and that of the Fear of the Minorities. The chairman of the conference was the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Mr. Alan Lennox Boyd. A nationwide general election was held to the Federal House of Representatives in December 1959. I should inform you that no party won an overall majority, which prompted the NPC and the NCNC to agree to form a coalition government, while the AG became the opposition party. The main features of the 1960 Independence Constitution. The 1960 Independence Constitution retained federalism with the regions having residual powers. The Constitution introduced a parliamentary system of government. It made Nigeria a sovereign nation state and a constitutional monarch of 3 regions, North, West, and East. The 1960 Independence Constitution provided for a bicameral legislature at the federal level, namely the House of Representatives, which is the lower house, consisting of 312 members chosen on the population basis, North 174, East 73, West 62, and Lagos 3, and the Senate, which is the upper house, consisting of 44 members chosen on the basis of 12 from each of the 3 regions, 4 from Lagos, and 4 appointed by the Prime Minister to represent national interests. The Queen was represented in the House by the Governor-General, who assented to bills to become laws. Decisions on finance and general monetary affairs were within the legislative scope of the Senate. For the regions, the Constitution established a bicameral legislature, a House of Assembly, and a House of Chiefs. The Governor-General was given power to appoint as a premier a leader in the House of the Assembly, whose party appeared to him to command the majority in the House, and other ministers on the advice of the Premier. Following the decision of 1958 Constitutional Conference, fundamental human rights were entrenched in the Constitution to safeguard the citizens' rights and liberties. It also provided that elections to the House of Representatives would be by direct election. Candidates would be elected on the basis of one member per constituency. The life of the legislatures, being referred to as parliaments, is 5 years. The federal government had power to declare a state of emergency in any part of the country if there was a threat to good governance and if the federation is at war. In the Constitution, there was provision for division of powers between the federal and regional governments. Only the federal government could legislate on those subjects on the executive list. Both the federal and regional governments had jurisdiction on the concurrent list. Residual subjects were reserved to the regions to legislate upon. However, the Constitution stipulated that in the case of conflict between the central and regional legislatures on any item on the concurrent list, the law of the central legislature would prevail. The Constitution also provided for the allocation of revenue between the federal and regional governments based on the principle of need, national interest, and balanced development. Moreover, there was provision for the Federal Supreme Court as the highest court in the country, while all appeals went to the Privy Council in London. There was to be a Judicial Service Commission to advise on the appointment of the Supreme and High Court judges. Thus, the court system comprised the Privy Council in London, the Supreme Court, the High Court, the Magistrate Courts, and the Customary Courts. As regards the head of state, the Queen of Great Britain was the constitutional head. The powers vested in her were to be exercised by her directly or personally, or by the Governor General of the Federation or regional governors who were her accredited representatives. It is important for you to note that the Federal Prime Minister and the regional premiers, as the head of government, had executive powers. There was a Federal Executive Council presided over by the Prime Minister, who chose other ministers, while the Regional Executive Council was presided over by their premiers. The government could remove the premier if the latter lost the confidence of the House. In addition, provisions were included in the 1960 Independence Constitution for the creation of more regions or states and boundary adjustments of existing ones. Amendment to some important clauses of the Constitution required a two-thirds majority vote in both houses of the Federal Parliament and of at least 2 regions. Merits of the 1960 Independence Constitution. The Constitution was unique because, apart from being drafted by Nigerians, it conferred a full independence status on Nigeria with the right to join international organizations as a sovereign state. The name Nigeria replaced the colony and protectorate of Nigeria. The division of powers between the head of government, that's the executive power, and the head of state, which is the political power, was to prevent concentration of powers in a single hand that could lead to dictatorship. Fundamental human rights were entrenched in the Constitution to safeguard citizens' rights and liberties, as well as their duties were clearly spelled out. The Federal Parliament, which is the House of Representatives, and regional assemblies composed of directly elected members, which resulted into the adoption of a uniform electoral system throughout the country. Electoral commissions were set up to conduct federal and regional elections. The judiciary was to be independent, as judges were to be appointed by the Governor General on the advice of the Judicial Service Commission. Let me inform you that such assignment used to be the sole responsibility of the Governor General. Also, the power of alteration of any section of the Constitution that was used to be exercised by the British government was ceded to the regional and federal legislatures. The 1960 Independence Constitution provided for a bicameral legislature at the regional and federal levels for good and informed legislation and to foster popular participation. The Constitution made provisions for the creation of regions, that is, states, and alteration of boundaries, thereby allaying the fears of the minorities. It abrogated and reserved the veto powers of the Governor and Governor General, and under the Constitution, official members ceased to be members of the Federal Executive Council and the Northern Region Houses of Assembly and Chiefs. The merits of the Independence Constitution. The Queen of Great Britain was still the constitutional head of state in the country, as well as the Governor General was her representative, who could only act on her instructions. Thus, Nigeria attained independence without sovereignty. Even the legislative powers of the Nigerian state were contained in the Act of the British Parliament till 1963, when Nigeria became a republic. The court of last resort for Nigerians was the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, to which appeals lay from the Supreme Court of Nigeria. The offices of Governor General and Governors were vested with the power to remove the Prime Minister and Premiers respectively. The exercise of this power could lead to a conflict of power between the political head on one hand and the executive head on the other, as witnessed in the Western region in 1962 between then Governor Sir Adesoji Aderemi and the regional premier Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola. The revenue allocation formula, which was based on the principle of need, national interest and balanced development, was faulty as it could not resolve issues on revenue allocation sharing. It should have included derivation. More importantly, the divisions of powers between the head of state and the head of government, as provided for under parliamentary model instituted by the 1960 Constitution, could lead to conflict in the process of discharging their duties. The constitutional provision that conferred power to declare state of emergency on the federal government could be abused by the executive or the legislature. This actually happened in 1962 during the Western Region crisis, when the government of Balewa invoked it to punish AG regional government in power and put its favored candidate in power. This particular provision questioned the trueness of Nigerian federation. Also, rather than promoting socio-economic transformation and national integration, parliamentary constitution adopted in 1960 merely encouraged regionalism, as major political parties were ethnically based to the detriment of the country's political stability. The political instability it generated was one of the reasons for the call of a Republican Constitution. Study Session Summary. In this study session, we discussed the major events that preceded the adoption of the Independence Constitution of 1960, as well as its major provisions, merits, and demerits. The 1957 and 1958 constitutional conferences held in London and Lagos respectively contributed significantly to the adoption of major provisions in the Independence Constitution. Not unlike other pre-independence constitutions, it is significant in that it conferred independence status on Nigeria and was drafted by Nigerians. Nevertheless, it promoted independence without full sovereignty in Nigeria, as the Queen of England remained the constitutional ceremonial head under the 1960 Constitution. Other weaknesses of the Constitution were also mentioned. End of study session 6. Thanks for listening.